Okay, well, for the sake of time, let's just get straight into it. Kuiraba, Nijegra Walakohu, Selena Ortega-Chiolero, Nijegra Muri, El Paso Kayak Tinsiaden, Tona Nene Resna El Ista, Atna El Den Nina El Nena, Museum Specialist Naidiniana Kayak, Ra Wesna, Chnen. Greetings, everyone. My name is Selena Ortega-Chiolero. I am Rara Muri, also known as the Taru Amara, whose traditional lands are in the Barranca de Cobre region of Chihuahua, Mexico. I live and work on Matanuska Riverland, traditional homelands of the Atna and Denina Dene, where I am the museum specialist for Chickaloon Village Traditional Council. There are many issues confronting the cultural heritage sector amid the pandemic. How to meet the needs of our visitors while meeting recommended health precautions, financial sustainability, and maintaining our relationships with one another, to name a few. One thing the pandemic has made more evident is the disparity between how our institutions function and represent our communities versus the voices that reside in them. The main challenge lies in how to navigate various perspectives while still preserving the identity and the mission of one's organization. The solution is embedded in the cultural competency of one's organization, its governance and staff. Cultural competency begins with the awareness of oneself. It's taking a deeper look into your biases and values. It's taking responsibility for the land and people where your organization resides. According to curator Ellen Engseth, cultural competency is attained through a framework that includes a concept of a continuum on which to locate oneself. It supports behavioral skills that support appropriate, effective, and positive interaction in a variety of cultural contexts. For the past year, Museums Alaska and the Alaska State Museum, with guidance from the Hawaii Museum Association, have been collaborating on a project focused on developing a framework for cultural competencies for Alaska's cultural heritage sector. After many conversations, we concluded that for many museums in our state, this concept may be extraneous. Consequently, we opted to begin this work by providing an opportunity to increase awareness about the need for cultural competency by sharing the stories and expertise of our colleagues who have integrated this framework into their communities and are doing it well. It is our hope that their work will inform and inspire you to join us in taking that next step and examining where you lie on the continuum and redefine who you are and how you are serving your community. We'll begin today's workshop with 5 10-minute presentations that focus on how each of our panelists have contributed towards redefining how cultural institutions look after the spiritual care of cultural materials, manage ceremonial objects in their care, consult and collaborate with source communities, and how they approach digital records and access to cultural materials. The presentations will be followed by a 45-minute breakout session comprised of 2 groups with our speakers and a facilitator. We will then reconvene for a final 30 to 20-minute group conversation. Although the presentations will be recorded and made available on the Museums Alaska website later this fall, the breakout sessions will not, in order to give attendees more reassurance that they can have meaningful conversations. For our goal for this entire workshop is really about engaging with one another and having these kind of conversations. For the sake of time, we ask that you refrain from asking your questions throughout the presentations and save them for the breakout rooms or until we reconvene at the end. We will have members of our planning group observing both chats, both in the Zoom and Whova, to make sure that questions are not overlooked. We also encourage you to continue having these conversations in the Whova app and with one another. We would like to acknowledge that conversations about cultural competency can be difficult and challenging for some. Additionally, many professionals and organizations come from their own distinct communities with their own set of values and needs. We also acknowledge that not everyone is at the same step in attaining cultural competency. Because of this, we want to reassure our esteemed panelists and attendees that this is a safe space where all voices are welcomed and that comments and questions should be respectful in nature. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist for the day, Dr. April Laktonen Counceller. April Gale Laktonen Counceller, also known as ISIC, is currently the executive director at the Alutiiq Museum and Archeological Repository. She received her Bachelor's of Arts in Anthropology and American Civilization from Brown University in 2002, her master's in rural development from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 2005, and her PhD in language planning and Indigenous knowledge systems from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 2010. April has studied Alutiiq for over 10 years and has apprenticed with fluent speakers Nick Alutiiq and Florence Pestrikoff. April is among the first in her generation to achieve advanced fluency in Alutiiq. She has also studied Alutiiq language extensively with her mentor, Jeff Lear. Please join me in welcoming Dr. April Laktonen, Counceller.
Shamai, hello. Hui April Laktonen, Counceller, aptaha nga ishik, ilanka uyaksach miwat chali achwanach miwat, mamaka Esther Furio, litnawistochea shunami, dadaka Jerry Laktonen, maskalista, kijahwikami et dachdok. Wika Jeremy Counceller, maluhanuk paniyanktwa, Laura chali emi, chali pingayunak puchtankhtwa. Pugdachtwanga Alutiiq Museum mi, chali etdachtwa mani shunami. My introduction was already given, so I won't translate everything I've just said, although I did add some details about my family in my Alutiiq language introduction. Thank you for inviting me to present today. The Alutiiq Museum is a very special place to work, so I'd like to start in talking a little bit about the museum itself and then discuss our spiritual care of collections policy. For those of you who do not know the history of the Alutiiq Museum, we've been open now for about 26 years. We opened in 1995, and we're governed by representatives of the Native corporations from the Alutiiq region, the Kodiak Archipelago. In addition to the Native corporations, which all provide annual donations to support a portion of our operations, we are also governed by the Kodiak Area Native Association. One of the things to keep in mind about our museum is that although we are Native governed and Native led, and we try to represent the desires of the Alutiiq community, we are not ourselves a tribal organization, and so we lack tribal standing, and that has an effect on some of our activities. In some ways, it can encourage us to collaborate more with the tribal entities in our region, because some funding that's available for Native organizations is not available to us unless we act in partnership with a tribe or with a Native corporation. The spiritual care of collections policy was first created here at the museum in 2003. It was written by Amy Steffian and Sven Hawkinson Jr., who was the executive director here at the time. And the policy really came from that desire to do what is right by the Native community and serve the needs of the Native community first, even though we feel that our audience goes far beyond just the local Native community, and we do serve and benefit the broader public as well. The policy has been revised over the years a couple of times, and so we do keep open the idea that it is a living document that can be added to and improved upon. I'd like to take a little aside at the moment and talk about the Alutiiq-Sugpiaq Regional Repatriation Commission. So we have a commission that is made up of representatives of each of the tribes on Kodiak Island. There's 10 tribes, but like I said, our governing body is made up of representatives from the Native corporations. So it is really important to understand the difference and the benefits of interacting with the tribes in certain contexts and the corporations in other contexts. Because repatriation and sacred objects we feel are more in the realm of the tribes, especially when NAGPRA itself is limited to tribes. The Repatriation Commission was created with representatives from the tribes rather than the corporations in our region. And the Repatriation Commission, like its name, is designed to help guide the Alutiiq Museum as we assist with the repatriation of human remains to our local tribes. Although the commission is also in charge of advising in certain ways on spiritual objects as well, because NAGPRA itself includes objects of cultural patrimony and sacred objects and funerary objects. That commission has provided guidance in that area, and we are planning another gathering of the Repatriation Commission. It was supposed to be September 30th, but due to local COVID numbers, we are delaying that probably until the new year. But that's an important body to keep in mind, that our policy was not just developed internally among staff. We don't make the assumption that because some of our staff are Alutiiq or Alaska Native, that we have all of the information we need just by virtue of being Native people, because we have non-Native people on our staff. And we also, as Native people, don't always know what might be sacred in one tribe or another within our own region. So now I'm going to start talking a little bit about the spiritual care policy itself. It is broken into categories. It defines categories of spiritual objects. The categories that we have in our region are ceremonial objects, shamanic tools, whaling gear, and some of these categories may overlap. We also have Christian church objects, which are really important in our region, with many of our Native communities having a strong Russian Orthodox background. Funerary objects, other objects, and under other, in my mind, that encompasses things that may be both utilitarian and spiritual. An example of that would be oil lamps, where they're an object of everyday use in our history, but they also have a spiritual element, which is very common in our material culture, that our spirituality is really interwoven with a lot of our objects. And so to eliminate something because it's an everyday object would be eliminating far too many objects that actually do have a spiritual aspect to it. The policy also contains guidance on spiritual care. So it has sections about staff awareness. When we hire a new staff member, they are required to read the spiritual care policy and sign a document acknowledging that they will follow the policy, even if they do not work with our collections. Even our business manager, the person who develops the paychecks each couple of weeks, signs that policy, because we all need to be aware of it in order to be able to support it. The policy provides guidance when objects are incoming. So if we have an archaeological collection or even an ethnographic collection that is potentially going to become part of our accessioned objects, we try to make note of whether or not it may have a spiritual aspect that must be respected. We have conservation guidance. So just because something is spiritual doesn't mean it can't ever be touched or looked at. The guidance shares that with our spiritual objects, a lot of times they can be cleaned. Sometimes there are requirements as to how much they're cleaned or who handles them. We, in our culture, have objects that are not supposed to be handled by women. And then there are some objects that are not supposed to be handled by men. Wherever possible, we do follow those recommendations. And we also utilize techniques such as carrying things in an outer box, so that if a woman has to carry an object that is supposed to be held only by men, that they're not directly holding the object. There are guidelines for daily care and storage of objects once they have been fully accessioned, as well as for lending and borrowing. The policy goes on to describe how certain spiritual objects should be exhibited, if they should be exhibited. Many spiritual objects are not appropriate for exhibition. Examples of that might be funerary objects or human remains. Our museum does not accession human remains, but we do occasionally have human remains in our facility because we act as a coordinator for NAGPRA for the human remains repatriations for our tribes. A lot of times we'll receive a shipment from an institution where they are repatriating human remains. And on behalf of the tribe, we will have a private area for those human remains to be held until they can be reinterred. We often will provide ceremonial support to those human remains by either having performance of Alutiiq dancers and Alutiiq songs, or sometimes when appropriate, having a Russian Orthodox priest come in and perform a blessing and also have an icon in the presence of the remains. There are cases where objects that can be considered spiritual are put on display when those objects do not come in conflict with through our spirituality of being on display. An example of that would be an oil lamp, where we considered a utilitarian object, but we do have spiritual care guidelines for them as well, in terms of storing them upside down to protect the spirit of the lamp. And so everything does have to be analyzed kind of on a case-by-case basis. The ending of the policy describes what to do in terms of conflicts between uses of spiritual objects and how we should prioritize the Native community's perspective over that of outside entities because of the fact that they are Native objects, and therefore it is reasonable to put those needs as a priority. I've probably already used up my 10 minutes. It's easy to go on and on about this kind of stuff because it is really interesting. It's really important. And I look forward to discussing our policy about the spiritual care of objects in greater detail when we get further on into this workshop. So thank you very much.
Nan, April. Thank you for sharing. And yes, I have a feeling people are going to ask you a lot of questions in the breakout session. Our next speaker is Steve Henrikson. For over 30 years, Steve Henrikson has and is the curator of collections at the Alaska State Museum and adjunct instructor at the University of Alaska. He previously served as curator of Sitka National Historical Park, National Park Service, and ethnology collections manager at the Burke Museum at the University of Washington. Much of his research focuses on northern Northwest Coast cultures, art, and ethnohistory. He has authored numerous articles and catalogs on Alaska Native art. Since coming to Alaska in 1988, he has broadened his expertise on the Russian and early American periods in Alaska and Alaska fine art. Please join me in welcoming Steve Henrikson.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this session. I think it's really an interesting session, and I really look forward to having the dialogue with you after the presentations are over. What I'd like to talk about with you today is a few case studies of how Alaskan museums have been able to navigate some very tricky waters when it comes to Alaska Native sacred objects that are housed in the museum, either as part of their collection or on loan to the museum. And it's really, you know, over the years, I found it to be quite interesting work because, and I'm really quite proud of how the museum profession in Alaska has taken on the challenge of trying to make their core values compatible with Alaska Native values. And obviously museums are coming from, in many cases, a preservation perspective, in that when you go to museum school, they tell you that it's your job to guard the collection, that once it comes into the museum, you do your best to not let any changes take place to the object. It should be kept totally pristine, and you are trained to minimize all the risks associated with possessing a museum object. And the goal is to make it outlast you and everybody you know, and to last forever. But of course, taking a strict preservationist standpoint on this really removes the objects from everyday life, and and takes it away from the reasons why people might want it to last forever. Ironically, by keeping it under glass, in some cases literally, you're taking away what's special about that object, and you're removing it from its highest possible use, and that is by the culture who created it, who owns it, either legally or philosophically or ethically, and who continues to need that object for the continual practice of their spiritual beliefs and cultural values. So museums in Alaska have been really on the cutting edge of making some of these things possible. And I think it really, I think we're just, we're in a really beautiful position to be able to do this. Not to say that it's without challenges and difficulties and sometimes friction as the different entities try to work together, but all in all, I think it's been pretty successful. So let me go into the slides now, and I will try to do the share screen routine. I think I need to go over here. Okay, can anyone see my slide?
We do not see it yet.
Okay.
There it goes.
Okay. I'm going to try to, are you seeing it full screen or front with the stuff on the side?
It looks full screen.
Okay, good. At the Alaska State, I've been at the Alaska State Museum since 1988, and prior to coming here, I worked for the National Park Service in Sitka, and that's where I had my first experience working with sacred objects in a museum collection or on loan to the museum. The park had an agreement with the Russian Orthodox Church that allowed for their complete reconstruction of the Russian bishop's house, and the house came to them with its contents. And as a curator there, part of my job was to work on this collection, some of which had been transferred to the park, and some of which, mostly in the bishop's chapel, still belonged to the church. But they allowed the Park Service to take those objects out, icons and the altar and other sacred sanctified objects, and ship them to Harper's Ferry for extensive 10 years of conservation treatment, and then the whole set of objects were sent back, and these were still owned by the church, and even though the building had been purchased by the Park Service from them. The church wanted to have an operating chapel in the building to maintain that as a sacred space for services, and all the icons remained in their ownership. And these icons came, I helped uncrate them, and they came back from Harper's Ferry looking like they were new. They were incredibly well conserved, and had decades and centuries of wax buildup and damage to them where candles had fallen against the canvas, and they were well used and well loved over the years, and all that had been cleaned off. And The park was hopeful that we could help the church maintain them in as good a condition as possible. But that still required the use of the icon lamps that sit right in front of the icons, and they had live candles in them, so there was a danger there. And we were able to work with the church and create some shields that we could put up prior to the service that would protect, at least temporarily, if a candle fell across them. And there were also some, another factor here was that once the chapel was reconsecrated, the women, female staff members could no longer go behind the iconostasis and access some of the museum objects and church materials behind there. And that was a little bit tricky to navigate. It's a federal facility. The building is owned by the National Park Service. And it was, I'm not sure exactly how legal it is to do such a thing, but we did it anyway, and we were able to come up with different workarounds for when female staff members had to go back there for safety and security reasons, that there was a workaround found for that. So we were able to successfully navigate that. When I moved over to Juneau to the Alaska State Museum, I was immediately really struck by this frog hat. It's a Tlingit frog hat from the Kiksadi clan of Sitka, one of the most historic clans in Alaska, because they fought the Russians in 1804 and have a long history that's been well recorded over the years. And this hat is really their most sacred of objects, or one of the most anyway. And it was in the museum collection in Juneau and what happened there was the hat went missing from the clan in the 1960s, and no one really knew what happened to it. There was a replica of it that showed up mysteriously, but the original hat was gone. And all of a sudden in the early 80s, it appeared in a Sotheby's auction catalog, and apparently a art collector had ended up with it and was going to sell it. And the clan and museum viewed that as, since NAGPRA didn't exist at the time, that was about the only practical way of being able to return it to Alaska. And so we pooled our money along with Sea Alaska Heritage Foundation, and the Tlingit and Haida Central Council, and were successful in purchasing the hat back. And once it returned, then there was a procedure worked out to allow the clan to have access to it whenever they needed it for ceremonial use. And so since this hat had been back in Juneau in the State Museum, where it would live most of the time, whenever it's needed to be taken out for ceremonial use, either in Sitka or other communities, there's a procedure for checking that out. Certain clan members are delegated the responsibility of transporting it to the ceremonial site and then bringing it back to the museum when they're through with it, and then it goes back on display. And this has all been something that's written up in our agreement for this, so each party knows what the other party wants to do with it and is okay with that. And it seems to have worked out fairly well over the years, and it is a living document, and we are willing to negotiate changes as they are needed. But I'm happy to say that during my time here, at least, that the hat has gone out at least 50 times, I would say, probably more than that, and it hasn't been lost or damaged during that time. And it is something for museum people. It takes a little bit of time to get used to the idea of it's like your kid going off to kindergarten, I guess, in a way, because you're thinking of all these scenarios, disaster situations that might result in the loss or irreparable damage of the hat. And it's just something that you do have to accept, that there is probably greater risk when this is out traveling and exposed when it's being used at ceremonies. As museum people, we're sort of trained to be uncomfortable with that, but it really, once you think about why we're doing this, it becomes more more routine, I guess, and to nowadays it's a very routine situation to have this hat go out and come back usually several times a year. Now, traditionally, a hat like that and other objects are kept in the clan house by and under the control of a clan leader, a Hitsadi house master, and inside the house, when they were all living communally, all the clan members were residing in the house, and they would have a compartment at the back of the house, often decorated with an elaborate painted and carved screen, like the one from the whale house in this picture. And behind that screen would be all these sacred objects would be stored away most of the time and only taken out at very special occasions. And so by having some of these objects in the museum, we're really we're exposing them to the light of day a lot more than they ever would have. And the clans have been accepting of this, even though it's a radical departure from how things used to be handled. So we have, in addition to be, for the museum side, to be challenged in how we do things and how we think of things, the clan also has had challenges in trying to wrap their heads around why it is that museums want to do certain things, which to people not in the museum field may seem absolutely like nutty. So I think by working together over a long period of time, we have been able to achieve a level of understanding about why we're doing these things, and we really focus on the common goal, which is we all want to see these objects live on and used by the culture well into the future. And so we all have an interest in trying to preserve them. And the museum has been really a sort of proactive about talking to the people that use the objects in the ceremonies to figure out ways of minimizing risk or mitigating potential risks. And so it's been a really successful program, and over the years we've added other objects to the frog hat, several others from the Kiksadi clan, and several others from other clans. And sometimes the objects, clans that we've worked with have asked us to care for the objects that they own. This isn't just objects that are in the museum collection. We have decided as an institution that part of our mission, and it's in the interest of the state of Alaska, to help clans and tribes care for this material, to try to keep it in good condition and to prevent it from ever leaving Alaska again through improper sales, primarily. And so we've taken on that role, even though it's a bit different for us. We've become really experienced in dealing with these kinds of issues, and I'm happy to say that over the years, our involvement in having clan objects on loan here has been just enough of a obstacle that it has prevented the sale of some clan objects, because people know they can't just sneak into an attic somewhere and take something out. They have to go through us, and we ask questions. We're empowered to ask questions by these agreements that we have. So sometimes the ceremonies are actually held in the museum. The museum has become at times a ceremonial space, and there's a picture of me holding the dagger, a ceremonial iron dagger from the Ducklawady clan of Angoon. They adopted me. And this was at the dedication of the museum. And I was asked to hold their sacred dagger that's forged from a meteorite long ago, centuries ago. And I got to hold this while the museum received its Tlingit name. And there's other kinds of ceremonies too that happen in the museum. We've had repatriation ceremonies here. This is a photo of a healing ceremony where the frog hat is held over a member of a clan to give them the strength to battle their affliction or their challenge. And so it's really, the museum becomes this kind of sacred space when these people come together with their atu, their sacred objects, and they use it in that way. So the museum takes on this new role that we don't have a dedicated space like NMAI for ceremonial use, but we do fairly often are host to these kinds of activities. We also have pioneered some procedures to allow for other objects in the museums to be checked out periodically for special ceremonial events. And in the year 2004, we were asked to loan about 15 really significant objects from the museum to the Kagwantan clan so that they could.
Excuse me, Steve?
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interject, but it looks like you have gone a little over time and we need to have enough time for other speakers to speak.
Oh, I'm so
Could you
sorry.
please just wrap it up?
I can. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay.
Anyway,
it's very fascinating. We're all really enjoying your presentation, but we are on a time crunch.
No, I'm sorry. I lost sight of the clock here. So I think I'm pretty well wrapped it up, but I do want to also just one other slide, if I could. The Kiksadi clan also has another hat in the Sheldon Jackson Museum collection, this Raven war helmet that was actually from the Battle of 1804, and it's the clan needs to use that periodically, but the covering on it is so fragile that any handling will cause irreparable damage to it. So we were able to devise a little traveling exhibit case for it to go in so that it reduces the risk of that damage from happening just through routine handling. So anyway, there's been give and take in these relationships, and I'll be happy to share more information if you're interested at the breakout sessions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Once again, I do apologize for interrupting, but we do have a few more speakers we'd like to get through and then a conversation. So I'm sure you can continue the conversation in the breakout rooms. Our next speaker is Terry Snowball. Terry Snowball is the repatriation coordinator of the Museum Scholarship Group at the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian Institution. He is a member of the Wisconsin Ho-Chunk and Prairie Band Potawatomi Nations. He has worked at the National Museum of the American Indian for over 24 years and presently serves as the repatriation coordinator for the Repatriation Department, which ensures that the mandates for the legislation affected by the NMAI Act and its 1996 amendment meet compliance. Terry has worked extensively with Indigenous groups of the Western Hemisphere on various community initiatives related to repatriation, cultural awareness, and special events. Terry attended the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he studied two-dimensional arts and museum studies. In his related experiences and capacities, he participated in the Religion and the Arts Initiative at Harvard University with Harvard Divinity School's Center for the Study of World Religions. He also was a member of the Indigenous Executive Committee for the World Archeological Congress, functioning within the executive branch and representing the global constituents of the 5th World Archeological Congress in Washington, D.C. in 2003. The Harvard Divinity School's Leadership Council Advisory Council member from 2005 to 2007, and then internally serving as a Smithsonian Ethic Advisory Board member at the Smithsonian Institution from 2008 to 2012. Lastly, Terry has also been serving as an external affiliate for the Purai Global Indigenous and Diaspora Research Studies Center, University of Newcastle, Australia, which is a research initiative to integrate global and transnational analytical perspectives and frameworks with research on Indigenous and diaspora studies and other related topics of race and society. Please join me in welcoming Terry Snowball.
Good afternoon, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here among the esteemed collection of presenters. I kind of feel like the band that nobody knows, or the performer that nobody knows, who opened up after the Beatles, or because there's two really good presentations that sort of preceded me. But I would like to just start my my presentation and talking about. Well, first I was going to share a video clip of the facility we work at, and if I can open it up, I can continue on with my narrative. Sorry, technology is doing what it usually does for me. And we're going to try it again. Hang in there, bear with me. All the above. Yikes. It worked in the preliminary, so alrighty. There it is. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Everybody see that?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, so what you're seeing here is just starting out with a clip of the ceremonial space that as it exists today at the Cultural Resource Center in Suitland, Maryland. And it was very much on the forefront of being included in terms of the concept moving forward when the consortiums were developed to create the design space for the Cultural Resource Center, where it was imperative that such a space be made available to people. And so what you see before you is ultimately the things that have been added to it, or even actually sort of organically made transfer from the research branch where it originally held the collections until it was handed over to Smithsonian in 1989 through the American Indian Act, NMI Act, sorry. And so these video clips are just kind of sharing what's happened with this space in terms of organically and or like what people have brought and or left, and or what we continue to provide as accommodation for people who either come to the collection spaces to want and wanting to see their collections, and of course seeing and actually making available to them the latitudes to sort of impart the divine, if you will, and or commune with these things in such a space. So ceremonial preparation or purification is one aspect to the room, but another part of it is, again, a sort of the communing or reconnecting of, recoupling of these objects that are held in this collection, because quite honestly, they are more than just objects from that standpoint, and more than just a temporal object. There you saw a location barcode, so it actually also records where the object goes at all times, and what record it provides in terms of reinforcing its its natures. But I should go back to talking about this rotunda is the welcoming center of the museum at the Resource Center in Suitland. But what you see in that sense is a large open room, which in another way of organically being making itself available becomes a space for numerous ceremonies or repatriation returns and things like that. So it is a much more neutral place or space, from the standpoint of just being sort of just an architecturally featured entrance to the collections. It serves a greater purpose in that sense. When the museum was being designed and its consulting consortiums, the concept behind it in the design criteria for the museum of the 21st century is basically themed on old traditions and new technologies. And so you have your state-of-the-art space that you see, in which we are now in the collections. So those were some of the aspects of preliminary guidelines. So there was input from the tribes and communities in terms of what type of aspects, architectural and or aesthetics, should be incorporated into the space. And so here we are on our entry level, which houses the majority of the ethnographic materials in the NMAI collections. And so we're going to just go into one of our compact storage banks and basically share with you some of the objects that are on various shelves and or the other forms of feature to them in terms of either being static shelves and drawers. But one of the things that, of course, come along or accompany these issues is that the objects that are held here are both, like I said, temporal or secular in one sense, but also of a deep sacred nature. The other challenge to that in that sense is that we're going to be dealing with indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, and you can't particularly aperture that to develop a policy that's going to meet the needs of each and every area or culture group that's represented. So policy itself is even something that's a challenge from that standpoint, because one of the aspects in any collection that relating to sensitive materials is whether or not you're actually upholding the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and its sort of articles within in terms of providing access to Native peoples, because that extends to that in terms of the collections. But also conversely, on the other side of this issue is individual civil liberties and or rather civil rights. They're actually terms that are sometimes interchangeable or synonymously used, but the issues are very concrete or tangible in terms of what kind of what kind of terms and or restrictions we can impose or present in terms of a context for an object is something that we isn't so that can be so hardly enforced, simply because we're looking at the issue of people's civil rights or civil liberties in terms of not imposing our policy or our practices in a sort of oppressive way because of their own beliefs. But here you see some of the other benefits that have been ongoing because of the pandemic, where we have a large textile conservation project going on, and it's really quite strange to be walking into the collections and not having any interactions with the people that are important to the relationship that these objects represent. And so from that standpoint, there are elemental things that we hope in that interim of interaction, such as this window to the outside world, that sort of affords these collections some sense of another form of temporal relatively in terms of where things are. And I do want to go to a different let me first get out of this one. There we go. Okay, new PowerPoint. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, so here we have our three locations in New York, Washington, D.C., and Maryland. And I just want to show a couple of slides that share the locations there. You see an overhead shot of the Cultural Resource Center, the photo on the left side with the bridge going out to the collections is here, where you'll see outside ceremonial space that's also provided. And this particular individual was Mama Michi. She came from, I think it was Bolivia, and she was Aymara. And one of the people, of course, that was not only had access to the collections, but also provided some form of ceremonial blessing. So programmatically, we do things from time to time in terms of either access and or enrichment from the standpoint of taking such individuals, traditional representatives from the Western Hemisphere, to all of our facilities to impart some form of ceremony and or get all the staff in touch with the fact of what the relationship these communities still have. And here you see some of the folks that have come through. And then in the central picture, we have a Navajo consultation where the representatives that were participating in a consultation requested that these objects be brought outside and given fresh air. And that was something that, of course, was openly accommodated. So in another sense, this is where you kind of see the actual use and or practice of turning such spaces into sort of the divine moments that can take place or can sort of give life to the collections. And I think the folks on the left were from Skidegate, and then the people on your right were the UA from Colombia. And again, this was part of an ongoing program we had with providing and or sharing both ceremony and cultural diversity. As well as you can see here, this was actual 2 different repatriations that took place. The gentleman on the left that's doing the signing is our former director, Kevin Gover. And I apologize if I don't remember everybody that's in the photos. Again, on the right side, we have members from the Central Council who are conducting a repatriation return with several of our staff in the photo. And next is another showing of some individuals from Warm Springs. I think some of the staff who worked with me up in New York in the Bronx and then Suitland would remember Roberta Kirk on the left, Ella Jim and Carrie Schuster, who from the Warm Springs Wasco groups. And they, of course, were conducting the various ceremonies in the various locations. So I guess with that being said, I can actually give back the screen to everybody. So anyway, there's a lot more I want to say, and there's a lot more that I could share in terms of both the utility of our space and or in my work as a repatriation coordinator, I'm caretaker of our human remains and or do make preparations and escort all manner of objects in terms of repatriations throughout the Western Hemisphere. And so from that standpoint, that's something we can make overture to and giving back to communities so that they can restart or resuscitate they have. Otherwise, the things that we do hold in the interim of such times is another form of where we have to figure out what conventions we need to sort of impart or establish. And we're doing that through the many type of integrated systems we have with our collections information systems, further measures to do enrichment or valorizing the collection in that respect to be I hope that sort of helps complement other aspects of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. We really appreciated the virtual tour. I can't even say enough how, although it was really lovely to see it in a virtual space, it doesn't do justice for the space. It's amazing when you go there. There's such a wonderful feeling when you step through those doors, the Cultural Resource Center. So thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Kim Christen. Dr. Kim Christen is a professor and director of the Digital Technology and Culture Program and the director of the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation at Washington State University. Dr. Christen received her PhD from the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California at Santa Cruz in 2004. Her academic research and grant-funded projects focus on the intersection of digital technologies, intellectual property rights, archival process, cultural heritage movements, and the ethics of openness within Indigenous communities, and with and by libraries, archives, and museums. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Christen.
Thanks, Selena. Let me get my screen shared. Perfect. All right. Well, thanks again, Selena, and thanks to all the presenters today for sharing their time and knowledge, and for all of you who are in the chat today. As Selena said, I'm Kim Christen. I'm the director of the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation here at Washington State University, and I work and live on the homelands of the Nimi-Poo and Palouse peoples. As a settler scholar, I honor their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to and stewardship of the land, the waterways, and their ancestors. And while this land acknowledgement is a necessary and long overdue step, it's really only a first step in working towards repairing relationships with Native nations and forging anti-colonial practices at WSU and beyond. At WSU, we have a system-wide memorandum of understanding between the university and 15 tribes in the Quad State region. So the MOU has very broad goals of strengthening relationships with the signatory tribes and improving educational opportunities for those communities. The mission of the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation then grows from this MOU. Our mission is to promote collaborations that use technology in ethically minded and socially empowering ways through meaningful partnerships with a commitment to foster long-term relationships with the Native American nations locally, regionally, and nationally. So to that end, we really work to sustain ongoing relationships with those 15 tribal nations, as well as other Indigenous communities through specific projects, through specific educational opportunities that are all driven explicitly by the needs and goals of individual tribal nations, as well as shared goals amongst those nations. So I'm very briefly going to discuss just some of our work and highlight structures and practices that other institutions, whether they're museums, libraries, archives, cultural centers, universities, can employ in order to start and sustain relationships with the Indigenous peoples in your own regions. So to begin, all of our work really revolves around, in the very first instance, relationship building. So as I said, because WSU is located on the homelands of the Nimi-Poo, the Nez Perce tribe, we've made sustaining those relationships central to our mission. So what do I mean by that? First, we've spent and continue to spend time with community members and staff from the tribal offices, including, as you see here in this photo, Josiah Black Eagle Pinkham and Tutlo Gregory from the Cultural Resource Program of the Nez Perce tribe. So in this photo, Tutlo and Josiah had just finished leading a group of WSU scholars, museum curators, archivists, and librarians around their homelands. We stopped just outside the mound behind them, and they told us a coyote story related to the origins of the Nimi-Poo people. So over several years, we've listened and learned from them about the significance of their territorial relations and material belongings. We heard their views of land, of language, and the significance of material culture that holds and is embedded with knowledge in many formats. So it was clear from these conversations as we had them that they wanted access to these materials, but as well as a pathway for that return in multiple different formats, both physical and digital. So to begin these conversations about specific materials then, we provide opportunity for community members to view, touch, visit with, tell stories about, and provide knowledge for the care and stewardship of their collections, whether those are material belongings such as baskets, beaded bags, or baby boards, or archival documents, photographs, and sound recordings. We work across institutions at WSU, as well as with our partners nationally and regionally. In fact, one of the images on the last slide was from NMAI. So to facilitate the shared goals of the Plateau nations to have these diverse collections returned to them, in 2008, we launched the Plateau Peoples Web Portal, which is a collaboration between 8 Plateau Native nations, WSU, the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture, and several universities and other state and regional collecting institutions. So the relationships with these other institutions are also grounded in specific MOUs we have with each of those partners. And the portal is one means of providing certainly not just access to collections, but to honoring protocols for access and providing mechanisms for authorship, attribution, and ultimately collaborative curation. The portal is built on Mukurtu CMS, which is a free and open source software that we created here at WSU and manage and have continued to develop over the last 15 years. Mukurtu is a content management system and access platform built with Indigenous communities to specifically address issues of access, attribution, and accountability within its core functionality and architecture. That is, there are very granular levels of access that are determined by local cultural protocols by each community for that community. There are also metadata fields for cultural narratives and traditional knowledge. And there's a set of functions that allows content and metadata to be selectively synced and shared with other institutions, allowing for that type of digital return that's necessary for Native communities to access collections that are spread across multiple institutions. And the technology certainly is a core piece of digital return, but it's only just one piece. To guide use and operations of the portal, we have a statement of commitment. And this is a document of shared responsibilities, our responsibility as a universities and the tribe's responsibilities as well. These details, the statement details very specific processes and practices involved in collaborative curation. And we also have a Native American advisory board for the portal to direct us in how the portal should be run and accessed and used. So in these ways, we're very consciously creating new curatorial and information management systems, specific workflows, and practices framed around Native knowledge and protocols for access, attribution, and authorship at all levels of our work, from selecting content, to vetting it for sensitivities, to determining access and protocols to safeguard communities, ultimately for both the digital and physical return of materials. So for example, in 2016, the portal's advisory board, after 8 years of work on the portal, overwhelmingly decided to focus on curriculum and using primary resources from these federal institutions to create their own tribal curriculum. So first, we added a curriculum module within the portal to sort of signal a different type of knowledge. We received an ACLS grant, and with that, we worked with community members to select content from the Smithsonian Institution and the Library of Congress to have those digitized and then returned so that the communities could create culturally responsive curriculum that could be used in both formal and informal educational settings. So both in things like language programs within the tribes, as well as within tribal schools, but then also in non-Native schools to meet Washington State, Oregon, and Montana State's guidelines for incorporating Native American history and culture into public school curriculum. So each of the 8 tribes defined their particular curricular projects and used content from across institutions to create that curriculum. The Yakima Nation, for example, chose a set of 1947 audio recordings from the Library of Congress that contained traditional songs. As with many Native collections, there were only very brief and sterile descriptions of the material. In this case of the feather dance recording, the description reads only, quote, "old song, women's dance with eagle feather, a sacred dance," end quote. So what happens with the portal is it allows for a review process of these materials. So communities can access the materials privately and vet them prior to any final decisions. And this can all happen without them having to go to Washington, D.C. So we worked with knowledge holders from Yakima, including Tutsi Danzica, a Yakima elder and singer. She recorded a community record and shared her knowledge about several of the songs, including the feather dance. So after this community curation process, there's now an audio cultural narrative from Tutsi describing the dance. There's also a new video of the dance performed by the Yakama Nation Girls Traditional Dance Troupe. The elder women singers, Eleanor Hunt, Marlene White, and Lucinda Bill that you see here also recorded informational videos for the curriculum to sort of provide an overarching context for cultural, historic, and social context for the songs. In addition, the women began to teach the dances that accompany several of those songs to the Yakama Nation Girls Traditional Dance Troupe to revive and relearn the songs and the dances together. So over the course of several months, we worked with them to record a set of videos that they wanted to use in their curriculum, both for the girls' dance troupe as well as a more public curriculum. And Mary Lee Jones explains that significance.
Good day, my name is Mary Lee Jones, and the dances that we have today, the social dances that we're sharing, I would like to first thank WSU for putting a lot of the recordings together. For us, within our community, it meant revival of some dances. We had bits and pieces like a jigsaw puzzle. And so having the portal, it helped us to be able to extend a lot of those teachings, to put our energy where we wanted to go in a positive place.
So like a jigsaw puzzle, as Mary Lee puts it, only Native communities can really make wholes from these pieces that have been scattered across repositories with very little access to date. So what can non-Indigenous run museums, archives, and cultural institutions do to aid in this type of work? First of all, respect Indigenous sovereignty. Work directly through the governing bodies of those nations to ensure that you're following local cultural protocols. Review your own policies and workflow. So look for areas where there are impediments to access or where standard practices just seem to wash over Indigenous knowledge. These may not be obvious at first, but reviewing these once you've heard the needs of communities and you're establishing those relationships will help you sort of see where your own areas for improvement are. But starting small is fine. You can also create formal agreements. MOUs and MOAs for digital and physical return of materials, regardless of any NAGPRA or other legal mandates. In fact, most of this material falls outside any type of NAGPRA claim or outside of any legal mandates. So it's really up to institutions to start that process. MOUs and MOAs are a good way to signal that you're serious, that the institution is serious. And these documents can start that, general and then develop relationships and move to more specificity. So you might start with something that's overarching and then over 5-10 years, move to more specific. And these documents can and should be reviewed and updated over time to reflect these sort of changes in your relationships. And just remember that repair is a process. It's not a product, it's not a single act, it's not an endpoint. This will be slow by design. The puzzle pieces that were scattered over decades, that takes a lot of time and concerted effort for that repair to happen. So thank you very much for listening. I'm more than happy to discuss this more in the breakout groups.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think it's only fitting the whole conversation about contextualization and records, and then also beginning the conversation of the return of materials is really appropriate, especially as we move with our next speaker, Brendan Castle. Brandon Castle is a recent graduate of the University of Washington Museology Graduate Program. He's from Ketchikan, Alaska, and is of the Tsimshian Nation. Brandon is interested in the intersections of Indigenous cultural heritage and museums. His graduate thesis focused on the integration of Indigenous languages into collection management databases at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture in Seattle, Washington. Currently, he's employed with the U.S. Forest Service as a NAGPRA assistant, assisting with the repatriation of cultural and funerary objects to Indigenous communities. Please join me in welcoming our last speaker, Brandon Castle.
Thank you, Selena. And I just want to say thank you to everyone that has spoken. It's great to be here with you all this morning. So yeah, with that, good morning, everyone. My name is Brandon Castle, and like Selena said, I'm currently here in Ketchikan. And today I'm going to be sharing with you all a case study on Indigenous language integration for the UW Museology graduate program, as well as the Burke Museum of Natural History. So let me just pull that up. Okay. All right. And present. All right. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
All right. Just want to make sure it's not the wrong one. Okay, yeah, so today I'm just going to be talking about a case study that I did focusing on Indigenous language integration. And this is a phrase that I've been using, Indigenous language integration, to describe the process of integrating Indigenous language terms into collections management databases, as well as other museum practices and aspects of museum work. And so this case study, I think, is really centered on the understanding the opportunities that language integration can bring to museums, including the opportunity to build relationships with Indigenous communities, as well as increasing access and the information that is associated with these collections. And the purpose of my study was to focus on integrating Somaliaq language, the language of the Tsimshian people here in Alaska, as well as British Columbia. And the purpose of my study was to better understand museum practitioners' perspectives of Indigenous language integration as a strategy for indigenizing collections management practices. And there is a lot to share here, but I did want to provide you all some geographical context of where the Tsimshian nation is currently, or where the boundaries are, and where the borders have kind of created a situation where there are two different types of spellings and ways that we understand and write the language. And so this was also part of the integration process, was understanding the differences there between the different orthographies. But yeah, to provide you all context, the Tsimshian nation is located at the mouth of the Skeena River. And the name Tsimshian, actually, if you break it down in the language, refers to the people inside the Skeena River. So Tsim being inside, and the Sian being the Skeena River. So people inside the Skeena River. But today I'm actually joining you from Tlingit territory up here in the north, near Ketchikan Creek, where all the salmon are currently coming up, and the cohos are coming up to spawn. So yeah, that's just to provide you some context. And so with the case study, I was looking at the needs, positionality, challenges, and impacts of language integration into the Argus database at the Burke Museum. And it's really focused on what the different ways that this work can impact museum practitioners' connection to cultural materials, and also the impacts for Indigenous communities and what can come out of this process. And so what I've found is through talking with several practitioners, Indigenous museum practitioners, as well as the collections manager of North and South America at the Burke Museum, Rebecca Andrews. I was able to work with her and others that have been involved in this process. And with this case study, I found that there are these 4 pillars and things to consider, and the outcomes of integration. And I will briefly mention or kind of describe each of these 4 pillars. And before I do that, though, I just want to discuss Indigenous museum practices and what these mean. And considering historical museum practices as well, and the foundations that museums are built on. And museums, they are built on these foundations of ownership and power over collections. And they've decontextualized, is a term that I've been saying, decontextualize Indigenous cultural knowledge, and the information that we can understand about these collections is removed from its original purpose and its original context. And the practices that I've been looking at in this case study are about how to bring that back and how to bring cultural knowledge and reconnect with what these cultural items mean for Indigenous peoples and how they fit into greater social networks. And some of the language and the terminology that's used in what I found is reflexive museum practices and framing Indigenous practices as a practical functioning of museums. And Indigenous museum practices, there's a definition that I think it's really about having Indigenous knowledge and authority be this practical functioning part of what it means for what these items mean for Indigenous peoples. And the term Indigenous museum practice, I think, has been really helpful in just understanding how we can utilize some of these technologies, some of these practices in collections management, and use that and have that be to better have museums be able to better facilitate these ways of reconnecting with knowledge. And so how that is different from other terms such as decolonization, something that I've been using is indigenization. And that can be defined as change led by Indigenous people with the goal of bringing Indigenous ways of knowing to institutions. And just to provide you the definition here of Indigenous museum practices that I've been using is the practice from and necessitating relationships with Indigenous communities and the recognition of Indigenous authority. And so the practitioners that I spoke with provided some really great themes and discussions about what it means to truly integrate Indigenous languages and also Indigenous cultural knowledge. And one of the major themes is countering colonial suppression in museums, and this can be defined as the active silencing of Indigenous perspectives and decision-making power, and in this case in museums, and how that knowledge has been removed. And so to counter that, how do we counter that, and how do we make sure that museums can move forward in a way that recognizes these histories and these negative impacts, and how we can move forward with reconnection to cultural knowledge. And so something that other respondents have told me was that it's really about this acknowledgement of language in these institutions and how to increase representation, accurate information, and truthful narratives within museums. And language is one way to do that. And I think it presents an opportunity to really have the power and ability to bring to life cultural knowledge and make that more relevant for our communities today, and also have it be a legitimate way to a legitimate practice for communities, Indigenous communities looking to revitalize language. And just to speak to that a little bit more, it's important to really reflect on the mechanisms and the methodologies that museums have considered standard, and understanding which ones have been disregarded or considered not compatible with best practices, as we're talking about today. And it's really about how Western museum practices, how they have categorically, taxonomically, decontextualize cultural heritage. And for me, it's I think it's vital in terms of increasing our access to collections. One thing that really comes out of this is increasing a sense of indigeneity, and how museums have that ability to be able to have us have the opportunity for people to come in and rediscover and connect with this history. So I think for increasing this sense of identity, indigeneity, I think it's vital for collections management practitioners to recognize how collections fit into social practices of Indigenous communities. And it's critical also for generations of learners and speakers of Indigenous languages to have access to the physical collections. For some, one of the respondents in the case study, it's important to consider too the objects that aren't considered eligible, or that the community in terms of repatriation objects that are within these museums. How can we how can information be presented in a way that continues and supports movements for Indigenous communities to really revitalize cultural knowledge? And that's something that I also was looking at in terms of collections accessibility, is understanding how collections management practices can be geared toward teaching, and how they can be geared towards increasing engagement with cultural knowledge. And I think that here, I think it's again really about supporting language learners and having more virtual and physical access to collections, increasing funding for integration efforts, and also being able to adapt and improve technologies that can help preserve this information. This all really started in a few different instances where the database it's unable to read, it's unable to incorporate the special characters that a lot of Indigenous languages use. And I think that was something that I really wanted to understand better, is what can we do and what can we change to make integrating this information better and more relevant for communities. And lastly, more of a general impact of this work is the social change that can come out of this process. In terms of museums, this process, I'll show you all in just a moment here of how we integrated these terms. But I think that it's important for museums to recognize to have patience in this process, and humility, and being able to recognize what the right thing to do is. And for me, working at the Burke Museum, it was a really wonderful experience, because the Burke has already done so much work even prior to these movements of decolonization, indigenization, has already done a lot of work to make sure that Indigenous voices and language is visible for people. And I think that this can change people's perception of Indigenous communities when you can really see not just the material, but also how people regard these cultural items, and how they are part of much larger social networks. And so for any language revitalization or documentation, it will require a lot of collaboration, communication, and also understanding. This was a start to the process. It was really about opening this door and opening a window for language integration and in general at the Burke Museum. And another way that this can really lead to social change is changing the way that we as practitioners are connecting and what we know about these collections. Something that I was able to look into was this idea of curatorial responsibility being a model for understanding these social networks of cultural material, but this curatorial responsibility also being this new generation of care for how we care for collections, how we consider them, document them, and create greater access to them. And then just one other thing here too is the recognizing throughout this process, with language integration and other revitalization efforts, it's really about museums being able to recognize the cultural continuation of Indigenous peoples. And that includes all aspects of Indigenous identity, from autonomy to revitalization efforts to language learning. It's about recognizing the needs that Indigenous peoples have and how these change over time, and how museums can respond to that. And so this is just a brief overview of some of what we were able to do for integration. And so what we did was we went through the Tsimshian collections and were able to identify some of the, I was able to go through several Tsimshian Somalia dictionaries and look at actual museum collections and associate these terms to these specific collections. And there's not just one type of basket or one way that we can describe a basket. There's many different types of baskets to collect berries, to collect oysters, seaweed. There's all sorts of these different nuances here in our materiality. And something that I found with respondents was that this isn't just about the material. Look in terms of a museum, what we see inside these, it's not just about the materiality and how things were made or what they were made out of. It's also about how these connect to our knowledge systems, our knowledge bases as Indigenous people. And just another overview here of the collections. So you can see we were able to look at the collections here and to be able to associate them with different terms. And something that I was able to do was go through I went through 3 different dictionaries and got the different terms that were there. From the Alaskan, like I was saying earlier, the Alaskan orthographies, as well as the orthographies, the IPA spellings that are in British Columbia. And currently the Argus database, it has some troubles, as many other databases do, has troubles integrating a lot of those special characters. So for the scope of this part, the scope of the case study that I was working on is to be able to integrate these Alaskan orthography, because they don't use the special characters. It's more spelled out. So that's something to think about too moving forward. So yeah, just to wrap things up here, there's so much to share. I feel like it's really challenging to have it be all just within this 10-minute presentation. So I just want to say the major takeaways here. Language integration as an Indigenous museum practice offers an opportunity to address historical wrongdoings by looking at collections and also looking at historical collections management practice and this idea of and this act of decontextualization. And integration, it also highlights the importance of recentering Indigenous knowledge, such as these language terms, and it provides us a much deeper understanding of cultural material. So I just want to say that integration, it can offer the ability to strengthen relationships by inviting communities to come to the museum to engage in language revitalization, and it's an opportunity for museums to prioritize Indigenous practice. So yeah, just to wrap things up, this is definitely the beginning of this process, and I think moving forward, it would be wonderful to see a process where community is there, language revitalization is at the forefront of how these practices are developed. And yeah, this process, I think something that I've really learned is that this process requires, patience, working with communities is some of what the respondents have said, humility, but also just overall an eagerness to better understand Indigenous revitalization needs. So yeah, just want to say Ntoiks at Newsome, thank you everyone. And yeah, I'm definitely happy to talk about this more in the breakout rooms.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was fantastic. For the sake of time, we are just going to go straight into the breakout rooms, and to kind of explain how this is going to go, I'm going to leave you with Bethany Buckingham-Follett, the curator for the Wasilla Museum and Visitor Center, who will explain how we're going to do our breakout sessions. Bethany?